and now recording as well. Okay, so I think Ron, would you like to do the introductions?
Okay, you see my screen okay?
We
Yes.
are, yeah.
Okay. Welcome everybody to this Future Teacher reflected session. If you're new to Future Teachers, we've run these topics twice before, and the third running of them is under the banner of reflected. So more reflected, more couched in experience and guest speakers, rather than ourselves, the hosts, delivering most of the session. The resource, which we'll put a link in the text chat, is I'm showing the page that has the page for today, but if you look at the menu, you'll find links to all the previous sessions and all the future sessions that we're going to do. And on the page, you'll find the registration form. We leave that live until the session is finished because people sign in, register and sign in late. And then below that, you'll find a panel that just became live with a few accordion panels here, which you can explore in your own time. A little bit about us, the hosts, and then a panel for each of our guest speakers today, links to their social media if they use it, and also a link to their presentation if they're using one and they've shared it. You'll also find the main resource that we used in the previous running of these sessions, Azertive resource. That's a really resourceful thing that you can look through in your own time, with lots of pages from both the first session and the second session. And some of you may have noticed that in the URL parameter that loads us pages, reference to the word scary. And that was in one of those previous sessions, our remodeling of the ARCS model of learning design to include inclusion. So we referred to it as scary. You'll find the recordings from the previous sessions and the text chat. The text chat from today and the recording will be added usually a couple of days after the session has finished, and then we add the transcript or the proper transcript at a later date once that can be created. So that's the main resource. We'll put the link in the text chat. As I say, I'll stop sharing my screen, and I think Lillian, you're going to do what people said they want to learn.
Yeah, so very briefly, we do ask people to tell us what they'd like to get out of the session. And today, most people are here, obviously, for what to do, what good, inclusive, flexible, engaging, and accessible content and activities look like, ideas for bringing content alive or learning activities, making them more engaging. Some people are curious about sources and resources, and again, I would point you to the resource that Ron demonstrated earlier on our website. That does provide quite a lot of good, useful links about sources, even OERs, and ways and frameworks to support your learning activities design. Some people are interested in the range of technologies that are going to be on show. And in terms of like teaching and engaging, how to kind of do their best for purely online learners, and that kind of balance, where is that balance between slightly more static contents that learners have come to expect from a site versus, the more exciting and high quality but definitely expensive resources that we can create. Staff development, lots of people wondering how to get their colleagues started on this journey, to move them away from, say, static PDFs, how to make things less zombie-like. And of course, we have people very interested in escape rooms, and hearing from Tim and Haley how they've managed to develop theirs. And we did have one interesting bit of request on how to cook the carrots so they still taste carroty and not mushy. So if you're here, we could maybe discuss that at the end. But yeah, lovely to know we've got colleagues joining us from all around the world: Australia, Colombia, Ireland, Italy, Nigeria, Slovenia, South Africa, Spain, the UAE, UK, and USA. And maybe some people joined last minute who are not already listed on there, but welcome everybody. And I think we can go on to the first speaker, Helen, and
Yep.
Alistair is going to introduce Helen.
Okay, thank you very much. I had the privilege of auditing 15 different modules, teaching modules for the University of Nottingham from an accessibility and inclusion perspective. And Helen's was one of the modules that I was looking at, and it really stood out, not only for the effective universal design for learning, but the thing that really impressed me was that it was also really thoughtfully crafted in terms of maximizing the accessibility of the individual activities that students were doing. So Helen is the Associate PVC, Pro Vice Chancellor for Education and the Student Experience at the University of Nottingham. And over to you, Helen.
Thanks, Alistair. So I don't really have much in the way of slides, but kind of just talking through some of the materials that I've produced over the few years that I've been involved in this. And just to give a little bit of a potted history of what led to the point that I'm at now. First of all, I've been teaching research methods and applied statistics to mostly unwilling undergraduates for 15 years now. I love it. I think it's great fun teaching people how to ask questions about the world and then use data to find out about those things. For about the last 6 years, I've been teaching primarily first year undergraduates, and I've been teaching using Excel mostly because it's used in the vast majority of offices that a student might work in after graduation. So I'm based nominally in a politics department, but I would say all three of my degrees were interdisciplinary. So my accessibility journey started with a lot of engagement with different individuals' needs. And the first of those was working, I think it was the second year of running this module, with a student who was fully blind and trying to figure out how to make using Excel, even with his support that was in place, but how to make everything in the module possible for him to do and to participate fully. So I started thinking about little things like, if I'm recording a video demonstration of something, talking through which menus I'm clicking on and talking through which submenus I'm looking at and key hallmarks of things that I'm seeing and what I'm looking for, but also particularly looking at things like data visualization. What in the world was I trying to convey when I came up with a particular graph? What was the key point of this? What did that student need to take away? And then you move on to another student who has hearing difficulties and relies on lip reading, prefers lip reading to closed captioning. And then you have another student who, as I now know, very common, color blindness. So statistically speaking, if you teach more than 8 students who are male, you probably have at least one who has some form of color blindness. But it was never something that we talked about, and the need to make sure that all of the graphs that I was using could be read and understood without that. So it was all of these experiences that kind of built on each other. And then I was working for a couple of years within my institution as a digital learning director, providing support for people in pedagogical design of learning resources. So I think the point that I'm trying to make from that is, first of all, it's a long journey. And second, that I generally try to preface with that before showing people where I have got to on my journey, to underscore that it was not an instantaneous thing, and it was something that I've developed over quite a long period of time. So to show where I'm at now, I've tried to embed principles of universal design for learning in all aspects of how I go about my teaching. And this was particularly important when we reached the COVID period, because this is a first year undergraduate module that has 200 to 250 students. And with COVID and remote teaching, I was doing it on my own. So rather than having any classroom contact anymore, it needed to be something that I could teach all of those students and give them a personalized experience without having anyone else providing support on it. I do have support for marking, I should say, so it's not me marking 250 assessments on that. So the general layout of my module tries to follow the kind of UDL principles of making it very clear where to find different things. We do have a set template that has developed over time across each of our disciplinary areas, so that, for example, students can always find their module handbook in the same section that's with the same label. So the first few sections there are static across any module that a student might encounter. Whereas the things farther down, we then follow a pattern of laying it out week by week. The basic principles of UDL of telling students what to expect, what to do, what I want them to get out of it. So each week has its instructions. And those instructions would also go out to students by email at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning. So it would be timed to contact them and say, welcome to this week of content. This is what we're expecting to engage in this week. These are the ways that you can contact me. These are the sessions that we're going to have that are live. These are things that you might want to ask questions about based on what students have previously asked. And then all of the content itself is based within Xerce as a frame for it. So I was setting up each of these as a kind of interactive workbook. So for anyone who hasn't used Xerce before, it is an open source program, and it is web-based, and it has a lot of accessibility features built into it. So unless you've turned them off, there are accessibility options as standard available as part of the package. So that was part of what I was thinking about, was designing something that was flexible to students, but there are also options within it in terms of designing interactive activities that can be tracked through either a SCORM interface, or that you can, if your institution supports it, you can have a direct connector that's kind of tracking what students are doing, how far they're progressing. And then I use that element of learning analytics to contact students and feedback to them about what I'm seeing in their learning progress. So I would go through about 3 times out of 12 weeks, and just trying to keep that motivation of saying, oh, I see that you've already completed all of the content for the first 3 weeks. Well done, keep up the good effort. Or, I noticed that you haven't started engaging. I'm a little bit worried that you might be falling behind. And giving them that kind of relative metric and feedback about how am I doing compared to other students? What do I look like I'm struggling with? And all of this, of course, I have to be able to do in a scalable way. So a lot of it, if I'm completely honest, I wouldn't know the student from Adam if I met them in person. So it has to be something that I can scale up for lots of people. But just to show you again, within each of these workbooks, they all have the same general layout. There's always an overview section. For the computer-based ones where it's showing them a new statistical technique, it's always telling them, this is the data set we're going to work with, this is where you can find it. And it actually shows them step by step. And I would say that behind all of these as well, I've programmed all of the alt text. So the accessibility side of this, I'm not going to lie, it did take extra time. So I did have institutional support for this in giving me a 4-to-1 ratio of prep time to delivery time in the first instance, to just try to support me with that extra time needed to program the alt text, to make sure that my captions on my pre-recorded videos were accurate. And then I do run them against the kind of browser checks. So I do keep an eye on what accessibility feedback I'm getting about how accessible the workbook is. And I try to prompt students who make their issues known to me. Did I respond to what you needed in order to make it more accessible? So within the computer training, I'm kind of walking them through what they're doing, why they're doing it, and then there's always a how. We're an Echo 360 institution, so if you recognize that kind of interface that's embedded, what it does is allow them to switch what format they're looking at. So again, in the principles of universal design for learning, enabling students to access the learning when, where, and how it works best for them. So they would be able to complete this by reading the transcript. They can play it at variable speed. They can turn closed captions on and off, and they can change whether they see me or not. So they could just make it display full screen of only showing the Excel screen. And they can change some of the settings, and they can record notes and flags of confusion and so on. So that's an example of what they would do for the video demonstrations. So we weren't doing any live computer labs. All of their statistics training was done asynchronously. And then they would have a series of quizzes where they would then need to manipulate data. And again, I had to think really carefully about how to design an interactive quiz that was scalable, could provide individualized feedback without me being there to do that. So I had some problems in the first couple of runs with academic misconduct, where students were sharing all of the quiz answers on Snapchat. So I had to reweight the quiz, but I also used question randomization. So I had to learn all of the little tips and tricks of what Moodle could be capable of. And each of the questions that goes into the quiz, there's at least 15 different variants of that question in the system, where students using a different variable, a different data set, a different time period, and then it provides them feedback about what the answer should have been. So it's a short quiz. It's only 4 questions, but on average, those 4 questions would take students, they tell me, somewhere between 1 and 2 hours to do. And that's because in order to arrive at those answers, you have to work through the techniques, and then there's several stages to arrive at that. So there is also an element where I am working with, sorry, it's blocking me on the thing, so I'm trying to switch tabs using my keyboard and forgetting what my shortcut is. So there is a preview quiz that they can also do, and that just allows them to check on their learning. I also have activities as part of the module where they're doing peer feedback, and they do a peer lit review exercise. They do not ever give each other a mark, but what it does is provide a situation of double anonymity where they answer a series of open text questions, and then they have to respond to the feedback, including if they rejected it and thought it was ridiculous. But they have to respond to that as part of the final assessment, because it's about reflection on learning. It's about that learning journey. And that's worth 10% of their final assessment exercise. The other change that I made was also COVID induced, but was the best thing I ever did. And that was because we were shortening our assessment lengths during COVID. And on this module, that meant I only had 1,000 words to work with. So I switched to doing a research poster. Just to finish that. But it allows students to do a kind of choose your own adventure, and they can do a classic style, or they can submit in any other format as long as they demonstrate the skills. I'll stop that.
You have a minute, Helen. That was just the final minute, so do go through it. Do show us that again.
Yeah, so talking about switch back to the screen. So talking about the assessment, I designed a research poster template that students could use, and I showed the same piece of research as both a classic kind of free text essay report style, but also on a filled out poster example to show them. And the criteria are entirely set up around demonstrating achievement of skills. And what I found is that this is the single most effective thing that I did that closed the gap between disability and ethnicity on the results that the students were achieving on the module.
Helen, that is inspirational. Thank you very much for that. There will be some questions in the chat. I've noticed the odd question in there already, and we can pick up the questions at the end in the discussion section, but you may have a chance to respond to those as we go on to our next speaker. But thank you very much for that, Helen. I'm going to go over. Lillian, I think, is introducing our next speaker.
Yes, our next speaker is Rob Shaw from University of York. He works in my team, He's done a wonderful piece of evaluation research with the Departments of Psychology and Biology, looking at their learning designs and how the staff were integrating learning technology in their teaching and learning, especially post-COVID, what they continued to do. And I think, Rob's going to make a brilliant point about, evaluation, upskilling staff and students, and not making assumptions really about how embedded technologies work. So over to Rob.
Thanks, Lillian. And thanks everyone for the opportunity to speak today. I'll just share my screen, and I'm going to be talking to you about a project that I undertook with my colleague Richard Walker at the University of York. And I'm really going to try and pull out some conclusions that are particularly relevant to today's theme, obviously, of designing and creating online learning activities and resources. So just some brief background. The project emerged from the need that we felt to kind of make sense of things, what the impact of experiences of emergency remote teaching had been on staff and students on the return to teaching on campus. So we wanted to find out how experiences had informed longer term approaches to learning, teaching and assessment, and what practices had been carried forward as a result. Okay, so because we wanted to take a comparative approach and to look in some detail, we focused on two specific departments, biology and psychology. They both took a very similar approach to remote and dual delivery during the remote teaching phase of the pandemic itself. So built on asynchronous methods, short recorded lectures, open assessment, so a kind of typical sector response. But they seem to have responded to the return to campus in contrasting ways, with psychology prioritising a kind of more rapid return to normal, and biology looking to take a more sort of flipped approach. So psychology quickly reintroduced large lectures for first and second years, for example, while biology continued to use recordings, asynchronous approaches developed during the pandemic, and prioritised workshops and labs for time on campus. And there's an example here on the slide showing people sitting around tables in one of biology's very large workshop rooms for upwards of kind of 80 to 100 students at a time. And just really briefly, the approach we took involved semi-structured interviews and focus groups with teaching leaders in the departments and with students. And it involved kind of 11 hours of discussion overall and around, well, just over 10,000 words of transcribed data. We identified core and sub-themes and used NVivo to carry out coding and thematic analysis. And I'm going to focus on the student responses, but you can see the main themes on the slide here, which hopefully will give you a flavour of how the discussions went overall. And the slides will be available afterwards if you want to look more closely at the main themes later. And I've also added a slide here that just adds some brief context from the staff discussions that we had about the impact of the pandemic in their departments, their choices made. The first thing to say is that standardization and consistency definitely increased in both departments. Psychology were already perhaps relatively standardized in their approach, especially to stages 1 and 2. And the pandemic drove biology to kind of do the same thing, to increase standardization and consistency as well. And it led to more of a push towards program level approaches to planning. So for example, considering workload across modules, factoring in online and independent study fully, as well as timetabled events, thinking about the timing and location of assessments across the broad piece and so on. Unsurprisingly, I guess, for both departments, the pandemic definitely seems to have acted as a catalyst for greater use of learning technologies within sessions and between sessions. So for example, there was a great upturn in the use of interactive tools within teaching sessions. So that might be classroom polling in lectures in psychology, or workshops in biology supported by classroom polling, digital notice boards, collaborative tools. And both departments also continue to prioritise making their VLE sites more consistent, organised and explicit, and offering more kind of flexibility in online staff and student meetings and so on. There was also a definite increase in both departments in the use of open book assessment, a shift towards a kind of greater focus on understanding and application in assessment, And that was particularly emphasised in biology as a kind of longer term strategy, underpinning that whole approach to teaching and learning through more kind of flipped learning approaches and a greater focus on application during on-campus sessions. Okay, so moving on to the student results then, I think the first thing that's important to stress is that even in a small sample, we had a picture of complexity and variety. The students we spoke to seemed to take different approaches to engagement. They seemed to express different thoughts about learning in general and about online learning approaches in particular. And that was from both departments. And it often came out in talk about the balance between flexibility and structure, and sort of contrast between lectures on campus and flipped learning approaches, because it became clear that students were very much aware of what was going on in each other's departments, and they would often sort of refer to people that they knew in other departments and pass comment on what was happening. So there's quite a sort of rich thing going on there. Despite kind of a lot of variety in personal preferences, there seemed to be something of a consensus that open assessment is a more suitable form of assessment for higher education. And I've just included some quotes just to give a flavour of the sort of comments students were making about these issues. And again, they're available afterwards if you'd like to look at those in follow-up. Okay, so those discussions that the students had a lot about structure and flexibility seemed to come out especially strongly when they were talking about access to online resources, especially to prepare for workshops, but also as a resource following lectures as well. And students described the flexible access to the recordings as like a blessing and a curse. So leading for some of them to real excessive time spent or dangers of falling behind. It also led to a lot of students talking about reassessing their skills, like were their note-making skills up to the job? And there were lots of references to it triggering experimentation or people taking more advantage of the university study skills provision, you know, with an eye on choosing different approaches for different occasions and different modes and so on. But just zooming in on what the results seem to say about blended learning, interaction and feedback. Again, there was a mix in preferences between lectures and workshops, but regardless of that and regardless of the approaches taken in different departments, students were saying that they really value interaction and efforts from staff to support their learning journey and make connections between different episodes of learning. So it came out again in both departments in discussions of interactivity within sessions, and also the connections between sessions and support for independent preparatory work, engagement within the workshops themselves as well, which wasn't necessarily always taken, you know, as a given that there would be plenty of interaction just because it was labelled a workshop and so on. Students valued the flexibility of the flip designs where they'd experienced them, but definitely recognised a kind of strong need for guidance and scaffolding. And without that, a lot of students reported that they hit problems, falling behind, missing workshops, or attending workshops but struggling because they've missed some preparatory work and so on. And that might be something quite familiar to people who've implemented flipped learning approaches in the call today. But across the board, students definitely wanted more feedback, not just in terms of kind of formative assessments, but just part and parcel of daily activities and ongoing support. So if you like, a kind of general approach and orientation towards teaching and learning. And just to pull out one key conclusion, students seem to experience tension between flexibility and structure, which can be seen in both departments in terms of study skills, workload issues, perceptions of a need for interaction and feedback, and confidence in their study methods. Students developing different approaches, but generally feeling a requirement for more support and more feedback, especially to help them structure their engagement with the more sort of flexible elements of their studies. And just to sort of pull that back a little bit, it's maybe worth just setting those results in the context of some research we did at York before the pandemic, which looked into kind of digital learning experiences and tried to find out student ideas and recommendations for digital futures. And that highlighted that there was a hunger for greater flexibility and choice. supported by more integrated digital services and kind of more networking and community building opportunities. But I think for many of the students we spoke to, those sort of expectations have been qualified a bit by a realization that kind of delivering on that flexibility really needs effective learning design, teaching, inclusive environments, and also digital upskilling for staff and students, and broader support for study skills for students as well. Okay, so just going on then to, I guess, the most important slide for today's talk. What are the implications for learning design and online teaching, learning and assessment practices? Well, I think the first thing it's really important to say is how important learning design is, which unsurprisingly, both kind of within and between sessions, and that's regardless of whether you're taking a sort of lecture followed by review type approach, or a preparatory work followed by workshop type approach. And it's essential to kind of explicitly design in those opportunities for interaction, scaffolding and feedback to better support the opportunities it might bring for flexibility and personalization and so on. But then alongside that, teaching approaches, communication approaches that focus on the kind of emotional sides of learning and prioritize positive learning approaches seem to be key to students to support their skill development and to support the kind of inclusive learning environments that they need to be able to get involved and to take more control over their own learning, and to gain from the attempts that people are clearly making in the departments to develop positive learning environments that where positive learning relationships can form between staff and peers and so on. So in a nutshell, I suppose more dialogue, more interaction as part and parcel, and more feedback. And both those things taken together suggest that there's a clear need for more staff support and resources to be able to deliver on that learning design and teaching practice need, and a clear need for greater student skills support. And as a final kind of word, just to bring it back to a practical focus, the outcomes of the research were particularly notable in biology, where they felt that it had chimed really strongly with the feedback that they'd had within the department as well. And it's kind of contributed to a shift in their approaches back towards a greater balance between recorded and live lectures, still supported by workshops on campus and a core focus on application, but with a greater proportion of time with on-campus lectures too, to support that kind of structure and that engagement on the journey along. And they've introduced more kind of fortnightly skills and community building sort of sessions with near peer assisted learning and so on, to develop those essential skills. So I guess there's nothing new about any of that in terms of what we already knew before the pandemic, but it's kind of re-emphasized that they have to routinely be applied in program planning to support a complex student population. And yeah, so I hope it's been of some use in reflecting on the importance of evaluation, in considering how the individual pieces fit together, and then sort of zooming out to look at the bigger picture when you're designing and creating online learning activities and resources. So thanks a lot for listening, and that's my email, rob.shaw@york.ac.uk, if anyone would like to get in touch about any of it.
Thank you very much, Rob. Even I'm hearing it for the first time myself from Rob, and I find that fascinating to kind of take that theoretical stuff and how it actually impacted the biology department. Thank you. So people, feel free to ask Rob any questions in the chat. We're going to move to our next speakers from Huddersfield Uni. We have Tim Capelli, who's worked in EdTech over 20 years. And he's won some awards, including the Best Game Award recently. And Hayley, who's worked within FE as well as HE as an instructional designer. And they're going to talk to us about their escape room that has been used to create this structured, innovative learning at Huddersfield. So over to Tim and Hayley.
Thanks, Ian. I literally won the award. I was shortlisted for the award, but thanks, Ian. So I'm Tim Capelli, as Alina said, myself and Leah from the University of Huddersfield, and we've been using escape rooms to with really nice feedback and evaluation, which I'll go into. So next slide. So Haley, we're doing this two-handed, so I'm a bit like Chris. The next slide. So to give you some background, we work predominantly in the Department of Nursing. And Department of Nursing, we have it's our biggest department by far at Huddersfield. We have 4 pre-reg nursing routes with 4 different fields and 2 intakes a year. You an idea of size, our September intake is around 300 students, similar size in January as well. And all students, as those people working in this area now, have to complete 2,300 hours on clinical placement. Back in COVID, in 2020, the Nursing and Midwifery Councils agreed that 300 of those hours could be simulated. It's now been actually was so successful they increased that to 600 hours. So our challenge was to create some simulated placements that allowed the application of clinical knowledge that would get if they were on real placement, as well as generic skills such as communication, team building, leadership, those types of things that again they would get when they were on placement working with colleagues and people. So the biggest challenge though is that we had to deliver these wholly online for logistical reasons and all sorts of other reasons. So why did we choose DEARS? So DEARS are digital educational escape rooms. It's a bit of a mouthful, so they're sort of commonly referred to as DEARS. So they're quite new in terms of education, but there is some literature on them. So one of the studies from 2022 by Townsend there said the cooperative search for clues, the distribution of responsibility, and the solving of puzzles secure the attention of 21st century skills. So that students get a lot in terms of those generic skills, as well as if you make them subject-based, they can get subject knowledge, but it's about those generic skills such as communication, problem solving, and cooperation. And those really resonate the learning outcomes that we wanted from simulated placement in terms of working with others to resolve problems, being able to understand your role in a team, how to change that to make the team work more effectively, and how to apply clinical knowledge to novel situations and help them think creatively. Next, Haley. We also wanted to make sure the best principles of simulation were incorporated in that: problem solving, debriefing, and briefing and debriefing, learner support, and guided and feedback, guided, etc. So we wanted to make that escape room very much part of a learning process. So not just an escape room doing and that's it. We wanted to make it very much part of a process so we can contextualize and relate that escape room and experience back to those skills that we wanted them to learn and get them to reflect on that. So we designed what I call the wrapper as well, not just the game. We designed the game and built the games, but we designed a journey around it. And this next slide here sort of shows that fairly well. So this is the journey that we developed, and the theme of this is around VLE. So we built this within the VLE, and I'll show that in a bit. So we ran a briefing session on Teams for all the students because, of course, this was all online. This is what you're going to do. This is how to prepare for it. This is what you need to read. Then the students went off and did the preparation on the VLE, which we use Brightbase. So they read through, we gave them some test sort of practice sessions, if you like, on the software they were going to use. Then the activity, and Haley will talk in a little bit about how we set that up and how we ran that. Then we ran a debrief session, always on the same day as the activity, so it's fresh in the mind, but we were able to pull off data from the activity. So Haley and I monitor the chat while they're doing that, and we pull off examples of good practice in terms of team building, which there is always really good stuff. We pull off data about how it took them to solve the problems, so we can give that back in the debrief session and relate it back to what they were doing. Then we got them to we built an app that they could reflect on their team roles. So it's based on Belbin's team roles. They answer a questionnaire. what was your sort of predominant sort of role within the team? And they were asked to reflect on that and going forward, so feed forward, how can you change that in the future next time you're in that team to effectively make the team more effective? Then we ran up again with a different escape room and different activities so they could sort of reflect on that and go through that process again. Therefore, we sort of relate it back to that team building leadership sort of roles. Next. So again, part of the theme of today's session is about designing innovative teaching. So this was the design process we went through. So we set up a working group initially, which was a mix of myself and Hayley and subject matter experts, essentially. First thing, confirm what the learning outcomes are. What do we want the students to get from this? So we did things on infection control, for example, on infection control. So we wanted them to learn about that. We wanted them to get teamwork and leadership skills out of that, and so on. Okay. Then we decided on the scenario. Then we chose the technology. Only at that point did we choose the technology. So the technology came after the requirements, if you like. We then listed the activities they needed to go through and mapped those to learning outcomes to make sure we were hitting them. So it's activity is a series of puzzles they needed to solve, basically. Designed and create those assets which allowed them to do those activities. Then, as I said, we built the wrapper around that, the sort of preparation before, the support during, and the debrief afterwards. So next slide. This is how it looks in Brightspace. So we have the preparation stage, the murder mystery in this case, which Hayley's going to demo to you, and the reflection and feedback. So we sort of built the content around those steps and made it hopefully, still intuitive and allow the students to do that. So next, I think this is your bit, Hayley.
Yeah, so this is how we kind of set up the activity. If it looks complex, it's set out this way to make it the most simple and most streamlined for the students. So as you can see in the orange box, we've got the learning content that was already created on the VLE, which the students would all know how to access because they've done the debrief and they use the VLE every day. So our game is within there, our instructions are within there. And then via their students' own timetable, we organise with timetabling to set up the different teams chats where they would chat through the activity and work as a group. So once they're on that, they would be automatically put in the groups that they were working in. In the background, me and Tim are also there, able to go into those groups via the chat to answer any questions, or to just go in and have a chat face to face with them if they've got any questions about how to work anything, or if they got stuck on an activity, couldn't do a puzzle, we would go and help that way. But for the students, they were on the Teams chat, talking face to face with each other, and then they could all access individually the Brightspace content as well. It was up to them how they wanted to complete the activity. As we said, it was about those soft skills like teamwork, especially this one. So how they conducted the activity was their choice, whether they wanted one person in the chat to take charge, share their screen, all go through the activity together, or whether they were going to work to split up that activity and all decide, I'll do this room, I'll do this part of the activity. So again, that was the student's choice, which we left up to them. So these are some of the activities we did. So we did an escape room based on the subject matter of the heart, and it was all like cardiovascular, things like that. We did an infection control one based around an outbreak of a virus in a care home setting. And the one we're going to quickly demo today is a murder mystery we did that was set in a hospital. So let me share my new screen. And this will be like a couple of minutes. So they have about an hour and a half. It's enough time basically for them. So the activity is in ThingLink, which we can embed 360 pictures into, which is how we did it. We made a sort of map of the rooms we wanted. So you can like go to different rooms and look at different things. They have these case notes about the murder that's happened of this victim, and their kind of task as a group is to work out who has murdered the victim, how have they done it, and why. So motive, opportunity, and murderer. Part of their briefing, they will have got this information prior, so it's not new coming into it. So after they've looked around the task, they submit their answers via a form, which then Tim will get an email for, which is how we were able to get feedback to them so quickly for the debrief afterwards. So just to quickly show what kind of things we can put in there, we can put pictures as clues. We got some really good drama students on board as well to take part, and they played the different characters. We set up a series of questions, and then we filmed them responding to those as if it was, you know, some sort of soap opera thing. So that was really good to get those involved, and it really added to the kind of the atmosphere of it, really. And we based this story sort of off some work that the lecturers, the subject matter experts that we worked with, it was sort of based on some ideas of theirs which we developed for this activity. So we got, I think, around 6 students to be different suspects, and then we embedded Word docs as clues. We embedded sort of PDF documents, that sort of thing. So students had opportunity to go wherever they wanted. They could, like we said, do this activity in whatever way they wanted. There was not a specific order. And it was quite good to see. I think Tim will show you in a second the conversations that came from that, whether they were discussing who they thought had done it, whether they were having some sort of argument about why this person hadn't done it, but they really got them talking. It really got them working together to really, because they wanted to do well on this, because they were really enjoying it so much, and I think that's because of how it's set up and the kind of the activities in there. So I'm just going to go back to our other thing, Tim.
Go back to the slide and then I'll finish off. So thanks for that, Hayley. So just move on to the next. Click again. That's it. And again. So it evaluates very well. Move on to the next slide. Will it move on?
Oh, let me try that again. Sorry.
So this evaluates really well. We get a lot of student satisfaction from this. They really enjoy it. They really engage, which is really often difficult on synchronous sort of teaching sessions online. You get students who don't put the camera on, they don't engage. With this, everybody engages. Everybody takes part of the chat, as Hayley mentioned, is really active. So just do you want to move on to the next slide? So here are some of the student comments that we get. It's well structured. They enjoy it. By far, this is the most favorite thing of the simulated placement, and you know, they a lot of different things are really interesting things on the simulated placement, but they enjoy this the most. Just pop onto the next slide, please. So success is the students, as I said, they enjoy it. They engage with it. It's very scalable. We've done it with 400 students. We've done it with 20 students. And they really engage with the group work, and they would learn a lot about themselves in terms of the team role. Things we learn, students don't like unfamiliar technology. We've tried different things that you saw the heart rates that they do in GatherTown. They struggle with that because it's unfamiliar. They're okay with ThinkLink because it's fairly intuitive, but GatherTown, there's a sort of a bit of a hurdle to get through. And the students can tend to focus on winning rather than the learning process. After the first one, which is the heart, I always tell them, don't worry about finishing first. It's not about finishing first. It's about the learning process and what you get from that. And students game. We learn very quickly that students who run this session, we had to break up the sessions on GatherTown, that the students who do it in the morning tell the students in the afternoon what the answers are. So we were getting students doing the activity in far quicker than it was actually possible. So we knew they were gaming it, so we changed the puzzles basically from the morning to the afternoon, and suddenly things slow down again. And don't assume they will work together. We put them in groups, so we assume they would work together, but often they don't. They just focused on getting through the escape room. They will go and do it independently and solve everything themselves and get out of the room and leave everybody else behind. We've seen that so many times. But again, we use that as a learning discussion. So when I feed back to them in the debrief, it's like, hey guys, this is about teamwork. What happened to you? What happened to people when they left the room and left everybody else behind? Is that effective teamwork? How does that translate to teamwork when you're working as a nurse? So last slide. This is a screen capture from a chat that I always like this one. I could have picked out loads of interesting ones, but we really enjoyed this one. So that was brutal, she said, but she did. These people who successfully completed it. So there's our emails. You want to contact us, feel free. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tim and Hayley. Very exciting stuff. I think, you know, all of us would love to have a go to explore the resource. And you have quite a few questions popping up in the chat if you'd like to answer those. And then now we kind of go on to questions. So any that you spotted, Alistair, that we should revisit from the first for Helen, Rob, and Tim?
Yeah.
And
So I think for Helen, Helen's answered most. I think Helen's answered all the questions that I noticed in the chat. So that I think is pretty good. And Helen's also, if anybody hasn't noticed, Helen's given a link where she's very generously sharing her poster and some of her mark schemes. What did I notice for Rob? Or anybody else, indeed.
There was a little bit of conversation around other institutions and whether they'd used an analytical approach to sort of evaluate what was going on. But there weren't, I didn't spot any questions for Rob, but he very kindly shared his contact details, so perhaps people will contact him directly.
And there was also Vidminas, sorry if I didn't pronounce that correctly, but there's a comment in there because she's been looking at courses as well, other courses, and conducting evaluations of learning designs. I don't know if you are online, if you're still with us and would like to say anything about that. You're very welcome to. You can open up the microphone.
Hi, I am here.
Oh, sorry, and sorry.
So did you mean this comment about evaluating course approaches?
Yes, and apologies, I chose the wrong gender. I saw the tiny little icon, and
yeah, not a problem. I should put my pronouns together with my name, but it's fine.
That's fine.
So, yeah. In this comment, I was writing about a specific course that I'm a teaching assistant for at the University of Edinburgh. It's a first-year course on programming for computer science students. We get a very diverse group of students coming into first year. Some will have learned programming since they were children. Some will have never programmed before. And this course is open to all. So we have to somehow cater to all the different audiences. One of the ways that we verify whether we're managing is checking how do our assessments work for different groups. So in throughout the whole course, students have regular quizzes they need to fill out. It's assessed, so almost all the students fill them out. And in the first week, together with questions about the first lecture, there's also a couple of questions on their prior experience. And at the end of the course, we use this to correlate them with course grades on the different coursework assessments they have throughout the course. So a practical takeaway we had from that last year was we saw there was a significant difference in grades of students that had lots of prior experience and those that had none for our first coursework. And so we've redesigned that to be more beginner friendly.
Right. That sounds a really simple and obvious thing to do, but I bet there's very few organizations that, or very few modules where that would happen. I think that's a really nice idea about getting the evidence and then adapting the course design to support it. So thank you very much for that. If there's any other comments that people want to make or respond to that, do put those in. I'm just catching up with comments down the bottom. There's quite a few comments about costs and time for the approach that Tim and Hayley were taking. So do you want to say anything about that? That cost, time and support, I think, came out there.
Yeah, actually, one of the things I didn't put in the challenges we had was we had no budget. Essentially, had no budget to deliver or to produce 300 hours of simulated practice. So ThinkLink was put in the chat. It's fairly inexpensive compared to most things. I can't remember how much we pay per year, but it's compared to most things relatively cheap. And I think Lily put in the Xert is free as well, so you could use that. And GatherTown was recently free on the account we use, but again, we pay about $300 now when we do use it. It was time. It took us a couple of months to produce those games. The investment is all up front, obviously. Once you've done them, we've reused them so many times, so it's, you know, the value, you know, that investment is good investment, if you like.
Well, another comment that I was particularly struck by in the chat here, Corey was talking about in the age of AI essays, it's particularly prescient to look at these completely alternative ways that are much more difficult for AI to supply answers for. And I think that's a really interesting point on these assessments. I am aware we've not had a lot of time for discussion, but there's normally a few of us will stay on after for as long as we can. But I know we also never give Ron the time he needs to just do his kind of little wrap up and kind of suggestion for you. So we got 4 minutes, Ron. Normally we allow you about 40 seconds. So if we let Ron do his bit, and then we'll stop the recording after that, and then we can carry on the discussion for anybody that's able to stay on. And we do encourage you to stay on for a bit if you can, just 5-10 minutes, whatever.
Well, I won't share the resource again, Alistair. The links in the chat multiple times, but the main point is before you leave, and I did put this note in the text chat as well. Before you leave, we'd like to hear what one specific thing, a real action that you will do from what you've seen and heard today. More than just look at the resources again or share the link, but actually something, you know, fundamental that you will do as a result, as action. If you share that in the text chat, it provides inspiration, it provides good feedback for the guest speakers. We obviously want to thank all our guest speakers. There's a wealth of resources in every one of their presentations that you can access, and you'll see the recording and be able to review it and share with colleagues as well. And in the link that I posted to the page where you registered, what became live just before the session today is a little panel with the guest speaker information and contact details, social media contact details, but also a panel that what you should do next, including joining our Future Teacher mailing list if you're not already a member of that. It's a low traffic list, but provides a way of providing further feedback and reflections and questions if you want to use it for that. And you'll find that all the links and things that are in the text chat today, you can save that text chat, I think, but also we make it available as part of the resource and the recording once the recording is available. So plenty of resources and information that you can access after this session. But before you go, please do share one thing. And as Alistair mentioned, we'll have an informal chat. People that are new to Xerti and 360 interactions, if you want to chat about that informally after we stop the recording, happy to do that and talk through the differences between the various tools for doing that kind of thing.
Brilliant, thank you. There was this Diane Grayson. I wondered if you wanted to come on for the final bit of the recording, just to tell us a little bit more about Johnson & Johnson's principles of cooperative learning.
Yeah, sure. So this is work that was done quite a long time ago, I think in the 80s, where they defined cooperative learning is not just get students in a group and have them work together, but there are very specific principles. And one of them is what they call positive interdependence, which means that the students have to rely upon one another. So the task cannot be completed unless the whole group is doing their part. And then they talk about one of their other principles is getting the group to actually monitor its own functioning as a group. So it's really worth going back to their work. If you add cooperative learning to some of the other really good design things you're doing, you will get students to engage in a more collaborative way.
Sounds awesome. Thank
And
you.
it's very interesting, isn't it, how so often when we're designing kind of new technology, new learning designs with new technologies, we can sometimes forget some of those old principles, those pedagogical principles that are tried and tested and maybe 50 years old or more. But even things like Socratic principles, I mean, the Socratic dialogue, 2000 years old, but it can still work really effectively as a teaching methodology. So yeah, that's a really helpful reference. Thank you, Diane.
Right. I suggest we stop the recording before we go into a reminiscence of the 80s and the 60s with Teresa.